Hi, welcome to the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice virtual conference. We are so excited to be able to present to you our panel and some of the things that we've discovered while working through the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project. My name is Danielle Harrison, and I am the co-director of the project. And I have with me today Frank Kovarik, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion from St. Louis University High School, and Chris Kellerman, SJ, to talk to you a little bit about what our panel discussion will be about.
Danielle.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Your internet cut out for a second, so we missed like 15 seconds for introduction.
And I'm wired.
You know,
I'm wired.
It's brutal. I know. It's really challenging. Let's try it again. Your internet connection seemed just fine until that moment. So we're going to call it a fluke. And we'll start from the go.
It's just telling me that I don't need to be there.
I get it. 2020 really is too much.
I really am. I am wired. I don't know what else to. Okay.
I know. Let's try
I'm sorry.
it. No, it's fine. It is what it is. We've all been there multiple times this year. So I'll just do the exact same thing. Start from the go. No problem at all. And we're going to call it a one-time thing, and we're going to be good. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, guys. Hello, and welcome to the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice virtual conference. My name is Danielle Harrison, and I am the director of the Slavery, Memory, History, and Reconciliation Project from St. Louis, Missouri, and it is a project of the Jesuit Conference of the United States and Canada. And with me today, I have Frank Kovarik, who is Director of Equity and Inclusion from St. Louis University High School, and Chris Kellerman, SJ, Visiting Fellow of the Jesuit Social Research Institute. Today, we are so happy to be with you to talk a little bit about what our project is doing and how we are looking at our history with the Jesuits and in slaveholding, and how we're using it to both transform where we are and make restitution for where we've been. So today's webinar, we are going to hear a little bit about just an overview of the Catholic Church and its history with slaveholding. Then we'll hear a little bit about, more specifically, about what SHMR does and the work that we do. And then finally, we'll hear from Frank to tell us a little bit about how that translates into a school setting. We'll then close with what does this have to do with Ignatian spirituality? And hopefully we will be able to give you some tangible suggestions and ways in which you can take this information and use it for your schools. So for that, we'll go to Chris Kellerman.
All right. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to start off just by talking a little bit about the history of the Catholic Church when it comes to its teaching on slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and a little bit of the history there. I want to start by saying that I think it's really important to know our history and know the history of the Church's teaching on these topics, because you know, we really believe in the Catholic Church that we're the body of Christ, right? That we're united to one another in the mystical body of Christ, as we say. That union is not just among other Catholics in the present. It's with all Christians throughout history, right? So we are connected to Christians of the past, and we're connected even to Christians of the future. So it's important then to know that if we're going to celebrate, Sister Thea Bowman and Oscar Romero and Ignatius of Loyola and some of the great saints of our past, we also need to recognize and claim some of the sins and problems of our past as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at the slides. All right, so I want to start off by talking about 3 common beliefs about the Catholic Church and slavery that I hear all the time. Number 1, the belief that the church has always been opposed to slavery. Number 2, I often hear among Catholics in the US that there's this perception that the popes had condemned slavery, but American bishops kind of ignored those condemnations or went and misinterpreted them for their own purposes. And 3, especially in Jesuit world, there's an idea that the Jesuits in Rome were really opposed to slavery, but American Jesuits kind of went renegade by owning enslaved persons. Unfortunately, all 3 of those common beliefs are false. So let's talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. All right, now in understanding the church's teaching about slavery, there's a really important distinction that we need to understand from the beginning. Number 1, sometimes when we talk about the church's teaching on slavery, we mean slavery in general. The practice of owning a person, of enslaving a person and owning them. So that's like slavery in general. It would apply simply to the idea of slavery throughout time, what it means to force another person violently into labor. And then sometimes when we're talking about church teaching regarding slavery, we're talking about this specific historical event called the transatlantic African slave trade that began to some extent in the 15th century and then increased through the years until it was made illegal by some countries and finally basically ended in the 19th century. So those are 2 different things that the church is going to teach on in different ways. Next slide. So we're going to start by talking about slavery in general. Okay, now, first and foremost, a challenge is that the Bible never forbids slavery. It never comes out and says you shouldn't own slaves. And in fact, pretty much all early church theologians were okay with slavery. They thought that there was a Christian way that someone could enslave and own another person. Except for one early church theologian, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. He condemned slavery as a sin and wrote about it in a few of his homilies. And it pretty much remained this way, that people thought, I mean, Gregory of Nyssa was kind of the exception. The church took this idea from Roman law that there were certain conditions that had to be met for someone to be justly enslaved. So for example, you could take someone as a prisoner of war and sell them into slavery. If someone's mother was enslaved, that child would then count under Roman law as a slave. And the church just kind of took that law from Roman law and used it in canon law and in its own way of talking about enslavement from early on. So what we had throughout time were the popes buying and selling enslaved people. And even at times, church councils imposed slavery as a punishment for certain crimes. So when we talk about slavery in general, for quite a long time, the church thought there was a Christian way that you could do it. And in that sense, thought that in some conditions it was okay. And in fact, the church practiced it. Next slide. All right, it's a slightly more, well, it's a much more complicated story when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so we get to the era of colonization, and Portugal and Spain both want to expand their empires. Portugal goes to Pope Nicholas V and asks permission to conquer and enslave basically the Saracens, which was their term for Muslims at the time, to enslave and conquer and enslave all enemies of Christ. Now, the way that Portugal kind of presented it was that, especially in Africa, everybody there, they're all enemies of Christ. So, and remember, under church teaching and church practice, if you are warring against me and I war against you, then I can enslave you. So Pope Nicholas V gives Portugal permission to conquer and perpetually enslave, quote, the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be. So Pope Nicholas gave permission for Portugal to basically go and enslave any non-Christians, any enemies of Christ, as it was termed. Pope Alexander VI in 1493 then grants these same permissions to Spain. And in 1526, Portuguese traders completed the first movement of enslaved Africans to Brazil. So we could say that even though perhaps Portugal was presenting things under some sort of false pretenses about who these people were in Africa, the church did give the green light for Portugal to begin what would eventually become the transatlantic African slave trade. Next slide, please. All right. Now, throughout the centuries, there starts being this idea, this kind of rumor going around that all of these people who are being put into the ships and taken to South America or to the Americas and enslaved, that some of them are being kidnapped. Well, this has never been okay in Roman law or church law that people can be kidnapped and sold into slavery. And in fact, in the United States, you're going to hear people saying, even in the 18th century, that the slave trade is wrong. So Thomas Jefferson, of all people, for example, despite his holding enslaved people himself and writing some really racist stuff in his Notes on a State of Virginia, he thought that the transatlantic slave trade was bad. And in 1808, when he was president, he signed a bill into law that banned U.S. participation in the slave trade. In 1839, at the request of Great Britain, who had previously gotten Pope Pius VII to write a few private letters condemning the slave trade, they asked Pope Gregory XVI to publicly condemn it. Now remember, at that time, both Great Britain and the US have banned participation, but there's still some countries that are engaged in it, including some illegally. And Pope Gregory XVI releases this document called In Supremo Apostolus, and it is the first public papal condemnation of the African slave trade. Pope Gregory, if you read the document, you'll see that he, like Great Britain, is concerned that people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery, which is true. It seems. Now it was probably other tribes that were doing that kidnapping, and I think that Gregory and most of popular thought at the time thought that it was like Portuguese merchants that were like going in and kidnapping people. But there was just a lot of confusion as to what was going on. But Gregory did not like this idea of people being kidnapped and sold into slavery. That is clearly wrong. So he writes this document saying that the slave trade must be ended. It is inhuman and needs to be stopped. Gregory, very importantly, did not say that people needed to emancipate their enslaved Africans. which the church before, on certain documents related to the enslavement of Indians, had said you must emancipate your kidnapped, enslaved Indians. But unfortunately, Gregory didn't for this, which shows that he was talking about this kidnapping thing. All right, next slide. Okay, so this news reaches the United States that Gregory the 16th has released this document. Well, from the beginning, U.S. Catholic bishops knew accurately that In Supremo had nothing to do with them. This document was banning the slave trade, not slavery in general. And in fact, and this is really kind of dark, even if it makes sense to us that, like, okay, well, let's say the slave trade was unjust and people were being kidnapped. Well, what about their descendants who were enslaved in the US? Doesn't that mean that that's unjust? Well, part of Catholic moral theology at the time had this idea, once again taken from Roman law, called usa capio. It was this principle that if I owned a piece of property for a long time, and my ownership to that property was like unclear or disputed, well, after a certain amount of time, that defect, that problem was just kind of corrected, and I now owned it. Almost like a common law marriage or something, that just kind of over time, it just sort of went into effect. So there was no need, according to Catholic moral theology at the time, or according to In Supremo, for anyone in the United States to emancipate their slaves based on the condemnation of the slave trade. And in fact, Gregory the 16th at one point told, before he released this document, years before, he was talking to an archbishop in the United States, John England, and told him that he was disgusted with the slave trade, but he wasn't that concerned about Southern slavery in the US. So the bishops knew that this document didn't have anything to do with them. And it was the practice at the time of bishops in the US to support, in a sense, the idea that slavery could be done in a Christian way. And in fact, the only bishop in the US to come out in favor of abolition publicly in the United States was the Cincinnati Archbishop John Purcell, who didn't even do so until 1863, after President Lincoln had already signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was just very common. I mean, Catholics were not a part of the abolitionist movement in any real way. All right, next slide. Okay, so finally, we're going to get to the point where the church is going to condemn slaveholding in general. But one thing about the Jesuits in Rome, so the Roman Jesuit editors of the really important newspaper La Civiltà Cattolica, they blamed the US Civil War and its debates over slavery on Protestantism. They said, oh, those Protestants in the US, they're all in a big fight and warring over slavery. If only they had a central religious authority like the Pope, they wouldn't be fighting, because they would know that slavery was acceptable. So the idea that like all the Roman Jesuits were against slavery is just not true. In 1865, the United States ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery except as punishment. And it wasn't until 1888 that a pope publicly said in an official way that slavery and Christianity were opposed to one another. Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical In Plurimis, he kind of takes on some of the theology, in fact, of the abolitionist movement and says that slavery is wrong. But of course, by then, slavery had generally been abolished throughout the Western Hemisphere. And is that the last slide? All right, great. So why is this important to know the church's history when it regards slaveholding? Well, when we think about Jesuits owning slaves or priests owning slaves, enslaved people, we can't really say, oh, well, that was just something bad that those bad priests or those bad nuns or those bad white Catholics did. it was something that was, in a way, supported by the institutional church, by our theology and our teaching. So it's really a problem of the church in general, these sins of the past of supporting slaveholding. So when we talk today about the vestiges of slavery in the United States, the wealth gap that exists between Black and white Americans, health disparities, the history of redlining and convict leasing and segregation, all of those things that are vestiges of slavery, the church has a special obligation as a major slaveholder and supporter of slaveholding to engage in processes of reconciliation and healing. I've skipped a major portion of history, namely like everything from the slaveholding era till today. For that, I would highly recommend that you read the work of Cyprian Davis and Shannon D. Williams, and also Father Brian Massingale's book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, to learn a little bit more about those topics. So that's all I have, and I will pass it back to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that. Whenever I hear that history, I know as a person who has been born and raised Catholic, it's really hard for me, because I love my faith. I love what it does for me. I love how it has sustained me and fulfilled me in so many different ways. And yet, here is this kind of atrocity that was permitted in the name of my faith. And so I wrestle many times with how do I balance all of that together, which is partly why I found myself at SHMR and in this project. The Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, and we say SHMR, is an initiative of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. It began in St. Louis, Missouri in 2016 as a joint endeavor between the Jesuits of the United States, Central and Southern Province, and St. Louis University. And then around 2019, it became a project of the conference. Our mission is we are committed to transformative process of truth-telling, of reconciliation, and of healing that is in conversation with the descendants of people that were held in bondage by the Jesuits. So that means we acknowledge the historical harms that we've done, that we seek to repair relationships, and that within our communities, we try to repair the breach and learn from the descendant communities to help us figure out the way that we can be transformative with this history, with this knowledge, and how we bring it to the forefront. The Society of Jesus, like many religious orders, as Chris had said, was complicit in the institution of slavery from the colonial era until the abolition of slavery. The number of people that were held in slavery by the Jesuits totaled about 1,200 people. And to know that in 1,200 people, that they were not acknowledged as people. They were acknowledged as property. They were acknowledged as things that could be shifted from one place to another. Again, and we know this because when we start to do our research, we don't find research just in the census or where they might have a folder that says, oh, here's our folder of enslaved people. We have to do our research under like grocery bills or product ownership or those kinds of things, which that again tells us how they were thinking of the enslaved. The Jesuits recognize that slavery is evil and that their slaveholding was a sin. And so today, the SHMR Project engages in historical and genealogical research in order to share what the lives of the people held in slavery by the Jesuits were like. We want to give names to the nameless. We want to bring dignity back to these people that really built the foundation on which Jesuits are living today, where they worked in their communities, they cleaned their houses, they fed them, they made their clothes, all of those things these people did and were never really acknowledged. And so that's part of our work, to give them dignity, to acknowledge them, and to say thank you for the work that they've done, and to find ways in which we can reconcile with their living descendants. We learn more every day about the lived experiences of these adults and their children. And our hope is that as we bring forth their history and their memory, especially to their living descendants, that we can restore honor, never running away from the fact that we'd committed an atrocity as owners of enslaved people. We are constantly inviting descendants, community members, and scholars to join us in this work. And if you are interested, we ask you to contact us as well. And if you may believe that you are a descendant, please don't hesitate to contact us, because we're doing that work every day. So that's kind of what we do. Another thing that we're working on is figuring out, how do we take the information that we're learning and then give it to our apostolates, whether it's our high schools, our colleges, our universities, our parishes. How do we tie in this work so that it's not just a history project, but something that teaches us how to be in today's world? And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank to talk about how he's using that information.
Thank you, Danielle. And I just wanted to start my remarks by thanking, first of all, Chris for the historical perspective that he provided. I feel that I've learned quite a bit in the process of preparing for this presentation from his work. And I also want to thank Danielle for all of her work with the SHMR Project. I've worked with Danielle for many years now, and I consider her to be a great source of wisdom. And I really appreciate the work that the SHMR Project does. And today I want to provide just a little bit of a narrative of kind of my own journey with this information about Catholic slaveholding and Jesuit slaveholding, and talk about how it has come to influence and be meaningful in my work at St. Louis University High School, where I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion, as well as an English teacher. And I think that one of the things that is remarkable to me as I think back is that this material and this knowledge is really not new. I mean, it may be new for some of us, and certainly I learned some new things from Chris, but this understanding and this reality of Jesuit slaveholding is not new. And it's really a question of, how deeply do we look at this reality, and how deeply do we think about it? And then what do we do with the information once we have learned about it? I first learned about Jesuit slaveholding in 2002. It was actually my first year as a teacher at St. Louis U High. And I was taking a course in Jesuit education. And the professor mentioned that the Jesuits in the St. Louis region had enslaved people. And I remember at the time that it was a curiosity for people. They were kind of surprised and shocked to a certain extent, but it really didn't become a major topic of conversation. And it's something that always stuck in my mind, though. And about 10 years later, I had become the moderator of a diversity club at SLU High for students. And I was preparing for a retreat and a talk that I was going to give at that retreat. And I wanted to kind of give a historical perspective. This retreat was, specifically designed for African American students at the school. And I wanted to talk about kind of the wide historical sweep of African-American participation in the life of the school over its 200 years almost. And I found in looking back at Gilbert Garrigan's History of the Jesuits of the Middle United States that he had devoted a number of pages to it. And as I read more deeply in that, it struck me as being pretty profound, and more profound than anyone beyond that one class and its mention of it had really talked about. And it was a few years after that, or maybe just a year or two after that, that the story of the Georgetown 272 came out. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is nothing new, and yet it is being talked about in a much more serious way than I had heard before. And it was shortly after that that the SHMR Project got underway, because a number of the Jesuits and the Jesuits who came to St. Louis were actually from Maryland and from the same province that the Georgetown Jesuits had been part of. And so, again, this information was not new, but something had changed in our consciousness, or was beginning to change in our consciousness in the United States. And I think that, of course, that had a lot to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the murder of Michael Brown, with the protests, and really the renewed awareness of the lingering and pernicious effects of the racial injustice that had begun with slaveholding. And so it was a few years after that that I was working on a book, a coffee table book, celebrating the bicentennial of our school. And I felt, as I was telling this historical narrative of our school, that the school's participation in slavery ought to be included, that the priest, the bishop, he wasn't a Jesuit, but the bishop who founded our school in 1818 was himself a slave owner, enslaved other human beings, lent enslaved people to the order of Vincentian priests who staffed the school in its early years, that the Jesuits who came to St. Louis from Maryland had brought with them 6 enslaved people, and that they had enslaved people from the time that they took over the school's operation up until the end of the Civil War. I felt that that needed to be included in the narrative. Kind of as Chris said, if we're going to celebrate 1818 and the venerable nature of our school, we also need to acknowledge the sins that the school has been involved with over the course of its 200 years. And I did receive, I don't know if I would call it pushback, but I received some concerned queries from some of the administration and some of the leaders of the school, kind of wondering, like, well, do we really need to include this? And maybe we could phrase it this way. And so I think it was a challenge for our institution to kind of come to grips with, even in telling our story. And maybe that's where it begins, in telling our story and understanding who we are and who we have been. Even though this knowledge has been around for a long time, to really understand and to really grapple with it requires some new self-awareness and maybe a changed understanding of who we are. And so in my work as Director of Equity and Inclusion, I've found it very useful to kind of conceptualize our school's history with an understanding of this long sweep of our school's treatment in levels of inclusion and acknowledgement, really, of the humanity of Black people. And so I kind of, when I think about our school, I kind of break it into about 4 eras. And the first era, from 1818 to 1865, is the era of slavery. And this is the era in which Black people's participation in our school was, as Danielle mentioned, as property of the school, as people who made great contributions to the school, but weren't treated as people. and in fact were treated as assets that added to the wealth of the school while receiving no compensation of their own. And after that, after emancipation in the United States finally brought an end to Jesuit slaveholding at St. Louis University, which would later split into St. Louis University High School as well, we had almost 100 years or 80 years of exclusion. So we had 80 years of our school's history in which Black people were not allowed to be students at our school. And in 1946, that came to an end with a single Black student who enrolled in the school. And we had about 45 years of what I would call an era of Black courage and Black achievement. So we had some very high-performing, courageous, remarkable individuals who came to our school and went on to do amazing things, but in the end were very small in number. And the level of inclusion was not great. And for those students, it was, I'm sure, and I've heard some of their stories, it was not always easy by any means to be a student at our school. In 1991, the school put out what it called the Minority Action Plan, which sort of set out a new course for the school's levels of inclusion. And that really began sort of the fourth era of our school, which what I would characterize as modest efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so over that time, we've tripled the percentage of African American students at our school. And we've made some progress, I would say, in the curriculum and in the programming that we do to make our school equitable and inclusive as well as diverse. But the efforts have been halting at times. We've had steps backward in addition to those steps forward. And so, as I mentioned, I think in the past 6 years or so, there has been some what I would call catalytic events. And that's a phrase that I took from a book called Roadmap to Reconciliation, which I would recommend. But I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has changed the conversation and has caused us as an institution, and has caused me as an individual in my role in the institution to think about the ways that Black lives matter, that the lives of the enslaved matter, the lives of the excluded matter, the lives of our Black alums matter, and the lives, of course, of our current Black students matter, our parents, our faculty members, staff members, and even the potential students and families and teachers and staff members at our school, that those lives matter, and that as we think about our future as a school, we need to kind of, as Chris said, grapple with where we've been and really make restitution and make that understanding of our institution's sinfulness kind of the foundation for our work going forward. And so one of the things that we're doing at our school right now is with our board of trustees, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee. And that committee is creating a new vision, kind of updating the Minority Action Plan from 1991 and creating a new plan and a new vision for where our school will go in the coming decades and in the coming century. And I think that as we craft this plan, one of my goals in my role in the process is to make sure that we always keep in our consciousness the history of Jesuit slaveholding and then the injustices that flowed from that, exclusion and minimal inclusion. And so, you know, as an individual at my school, I don't feel that I have the answers, but I'm happy and I'm proud to be connected with the SHMR Project to the extent that I am, and I am grateful for the way that the SHMR Project is informing the work that we're doing and helping us always to keep in mind the historical reality of our school's identity, where we've been, so that we can do better in the future.
Frank. So I know you're probably thinking, you know, what does this have to do with my school? Especially if I'm not on the East Coast or my school didn't have chattel slavery, they weren't involved in that. Why should we care? And I think Frank and Chris both kind of gave a layout of why looking at our history really prepares us to deal with our present and our future. The co-director of the SHMR said to me the other week when we were looking at what was happening in Wisconsin, and he said, you know, Danielle, if you look at that scene of James Boyce being shot at in the middle of a neighborhood in front of his children in the middle of the day. You go back maybe 200 years and you could see an overseer whipping an enslaved person in front of his family in the middle of the day. And that just image has really been very poignant in my mind, because to me it says that the idea of slavery we have not grown as a country from it. We have simply changed the name from enslaved chattel slavery to segregation, and now mass incarceration. We talked about redlining, disparities in wealth and public health. All of that is simply another way of talking about chattel slavery. And the fact that we don't address it means that we will continue to repeat it. The other thing that's important to know is that all of our Jesuit experiences, all the Jesuit apostolates in the United States and in Canada, come from the Maryland province. So even if you say, well, I'm in Colorado and we didn't have chattel slaves, but your history is traced. So you benefit from what happened those years ago, and we need to acknowledge that. And then, as being people of Ignatian spirituality and using that Ignatian language, why would we be called to do this work? We know that Ignatian spirituality calls us to find God in all things. Find God in all things, not just the good things, but the bad things, and to recognize what we've done. We are called, as people who follow Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality, to do an examen, to look, to see where we both have embraced the grace of God and where we have missed it. And I dare say that we did miss it terribly for many, many years as we held people enslaved. It's important for us to acknowledge that. It's important for us to acknowledge that and then to say, God, give me the grace to see where I can do better. This work it helps us learn how to detach and to be free. When we talk about Ignatian spirituality, we say that we want to be detached. We want to be free to be fully engaged in where God wants to lead us and where God wants to take us. If we look at the work of the SHMR, we are asking people to really just free themselves from the detachment of needing to be right, of needing to say, I didn't do that, of needing to say, well, it's not my fault. Instead, we want to come together as a community, right? If we say that slavery is our original sin, then as a community, we say, we want to be healed from that. And how do we enter into that work? Lastly, I say, as Ignatian followers, we are contemplatives in action, so that we are always reflecting on where we're coming from, but we're using that to propel us into action, into change the directory, to change the movement, to interrupt what may be happening, to go to a new shift. So Ignatian spirituality supports us 100% in this work. And now more than ever, as we said, this past summer has shown that this is a work that is not just for Black individuals in this country, but we are coming together as a community, as a country, even as a world, to say we need to look at our history to change how we live in the present in terms of the racial injustices that we continue to see. And then how can we add a transformative piece and a transformative voice that will make things be different? So that's why we do it. And that's why we need you to help us do it. And so we're just so grateful and thankful that you have come to the teach-in, that you continue to stand and do the work, that you continue to support and envision a better way of living, embracing our brokenness, but allowing that to move us to a better direction. So on behalf of myself and Frank and Chris, we thank you for listening and being with us today. And we hope that you, if you have any questions, that you will find us in the Zoom question. I think they'll give you a time. I think it's in October later on where you can kind of zoom in and we'll be live with some questions. Thank you so much. God bless.